All right, welcome to Cascading Leadership Episode 3. Be good if I get the name of the show right. Hey, I'm new at this whole thing. Don't mock me. So for those of you who caught Episode 2, that was the part 1 of Lawrence Brown's origin story. And we went all the way from his time as a Bahamian Ute all the way through college, and now we're here. So part 2 of the origin story, Lawrence Brown Endgame, is going to be... I'm so dumb.
We're huge Marvel fans, FYI. Spoiler alert.
Yeah. So part 2 is going to be picking up right from Lawrence's time graduating college and how that transitioned into his professional career all the way to, current day in the future. So a lot of ground to cover and definitely some lessons learned, certainly like the previous episode. So Lawrence, one of the things that stood out in the previous episode was how your instructors and in college really honed your critical thinking skills, your push to improve or continuously improve, that sort of laid the foundations. So with that foundation being laid, how did that propel you into your professional career? Where did you end up landing, and tell us about that?
Yeah, I would say that it's kind of funny though, and I don't even know if you know these parts, but so after graduation, I was a bit of a wayward child. So I think, not very meaningful roles, if I'm being transparent. I think part of it was that I don't know that I was necessarily focused on, coming out and taking the world by storm. Throughout my college years, the other part was that I did a lot, right, of soul searching, particularly in the last parts. And so when I came out, I think that I had this idea and notion that I was going to be like an amazing entrepreneur right out of the gate. So had no capital, had no real ideas other than I knew that I wanted to be independent or whatever. So when I settled in, I think that it was the opportunity to work for this company that everybody dreams of, is renting cars. It's such a funny story because we all have this conversation. For those of us, Jim also used to work for the same company, and
best dressed car washers in the history of car washers.
Absolutely, Brooks Brothers and Johnston and Murphy, and all of that.
And you better make sure your shoes shine.
Absolutely. After you come out of washing cars the whole day. But I do think that as an organization, it was a really great fit for folks who have a drive. They sell you on, you get to run your own business, which is an absolute true statement. We learned to run an organization from end to end. And so what I will tell you is that when I started there, what was evident. So I actually, at the time, I had my own screen printing company. So I was doing, T-shirts. And so I think we did that for about 1.5 years, maybe 2 years, and then it tanked. We started with no capital. We ended with no capital, frankly. And I went in to sell our service to a recruiter. And the recruiter said, "Hey, I'm not really interested in buying any T-shirts, but I tell you what, I like your sales pitch. If you're ever interested, I have this company that you might be interested in working with." And I'm like, "I don't want to work for a company. I want to do my own thing," and blah, blah, blah. And he shared, well, they teach you how to be an entrepreneur. So he said, worst case scenario, you can go and work there for a couple of years, and you can work out the kinks of the things that you didn't quite get when you were trying to be, as you're trying to be an entrepreneur. And I was like, okay, well, fine. I'll think about it. I think it must have been maybe a month or two later when we, went under. We just couldn't, afford to stay afloat. And I went back in, I was talking to the recruiter, and one of my good friends, he asked me, he said, "Oh, Sam and Sam Cunningham." And I said, I was like, "Yeah, I know Sam Cunningham." And he's like, "Well, Sam works there and is doing absolutely amazing." And so Sam and I are very competitive. He went to Waukegan East. I went to Waukegan West high schools.
You're competitive against it's not just you and Sam. It's you and whoever happens to be walking down the street.
That's true.
So,
That's true. That's
Continue.
true. That's
Continue.
true. So I am the common denominator, right? So it was interesting because he was saying Sam's doing really well. He's number one. And I was like, really? I was like, oh, I need to hear more about this company. So he did the outlay, which I'm sure you got something similar, and showed what the potential was that you could make. And it was very aggressive. To this day, I think if you paid me $100, I don't remember what the draw was. I just looked at what the earning potential was as you move up the food chain. And to your point about being competitive, the funny thing was is that I was looking at the timeline for it had 24 to 36 months for you to get to this level and 24 to 36 months to get to this level. And all I could see was, okay, I'm going to do that in 18 months. I'm going to do that in 18 months. I'm going to do that in 18 months. And as I did that in 18 months, I did that in 18 months, I did that in 18 months. And so when I got into the company, that whole idea of work ethic, that whole idea of being able to critically think became just absolute tools that served me well. Because when I think about it, like one of the things that I saw was that, as you know, nobody wanted to work on the weekends. So I think when I first started with the company, for the first 14 to 16 months, I worked every Saturday. And the reason that I worked every Saturday is because I found out nobody wanted to work on Saturdays. And so I could work at all the different branches. And I would get to be there as a trainee, which we weren't supposed to do, if you remember, but because they trusted me and because I was mature and I knew how to take care of the branch, I was getting the opportunity to run the branch myself and learn ins and outs. There were things that unless the branch was burning down, I never called the manager. Sometimes the branches would close at 12 o'clock. Sometimes I'd be there till 4 or 5 o'clock trying to figure out something. And I didn't want to call them because once you call them, then they would lack the confidence to let you do it again. And sometimes I would call all the other people at other branches and say, how do you do this? Other trainees or other assistant managers, and in some instances, branch managers. And what I found was that when these managers would come back in on a Monday and everything was staged, all the cars were clean, all the contracts where they're supposed to be, and all of it gave me a competitive advantage over my peers. And so that's how I was able to move through the system so quickly at these 18-month clips. And the other thing was that I had set the expectation for myself, and those goals, I treated them like it was the term that I've heard people say, and I don't know the exact historical reference, but it was like burning the ships kind of thing, where I said, under every circumstance possible, I'm going to hit this 18-month goal. Now, it turned out, I think, frankly, that it probably worked against me a little bit sometimes because I was so predicated on the 18-month objective that when someone would say, okay, well, we'll probably another 6 months or probably another year, oh man, I would about, lose my mind. Are you serious? This can't happen. And in retrospect, I'm sure that I probably rubbed people the wrong way, but I don't know, honestly, even in retrospect, that I regret it, right? Because I was able to hit the things that I wanted to hit. And quite frankly, I was somewhat living into what I had learned from the HBCU experience, where you needed to do extra to give yourself that advantage to be able to stand out. When I was managing the branch in Waukegan, which you probably remember, our customer service scores had to be above the corporate average in order to get promoted. And we could not get that turned around. And I literally went out and spent, if not the whole week, almost a full week at the airport location to learn how they did it, because their organization and the moving parts were 10 times what our branch was. And they were able to have that above corporate average goal. They were able to hit it. And sure enough, within one cycle, which was 30 days, we were able to turn that around because of everything that I went up there and learned. And a lot of it was emotional intelligence at its best. It was the way that they learned how to understand who they were, what they were capable of as individuals and as a branch. They understood the needs of their customer. They knew expectation levels, and then they met them, and then they were maniacal about making the necessary changes in order to succeed. And so I replicated that. And I think, as you also know, I had the opportunity to take, which a lot of people don't really necessarily see this as an advantage, but I enjoyed being in branches that were underperforming. And I thought that the first time that happened for me, I thought, wow, what was I thinking when I said yes? But I had a leader that I believed in, who believed in me, that said, look, if you can turn this around, there are going to be a lot of eyes on you. And I did turn it around. And then he made the comment, right, that I'll never forget, that was something along the lines, if you can turn around a failing enterprise, a failing operation, and you can move the needle incrementally, you look like a rock star. He said, but if you take on an enterprise that is on automatic pilot or perceived to be on automatic pilot, and you let that thing crash, it's a career ender. And I went, makes sense. And so I've
Well,
always,
even if it doesn't go backwards, if you just maintain it,
Absolutely.
What do you accomplish? So there's a couple things that you said that I want to react to. And one of the ones that you mentioned is that you had this timeline. And I don't know if it was a self-imposed timeline or a
Yeah,
timeline that
definitely.
was okay.
Yeah.
So in your pursuit of that timeline, one of the things that you mentioned was that because of, and I'm paraphrasing, because of how I was wired towards attainment of that objective, I didn't really care if I rubbed people the wrong way. And the reason why I'm latching onto that is in that moment, that was probably fine. But what do you think
Mhm.
the implications were if you paid more attention
Oh,
to that and where your career would have been? And then how has that changed? So, two questions. Um,
yeah, I think about that a lot. I think maturity has allowed me to see that if I had exercised better emotional intelligence, in all likelihood, I would still be there and I would be much further up in the organization. I think that when I can say this now, like because I've matured so much, but I think if you'd asked me a year or two after leaving the enterprise, I would never have thought this. But I think that it would have also given me the opportunity. Here's what I mean by emotional intelligence. So the emotional intelligence side of me would have been like, okay, take a step back because you should consider how you are impacting people. And how I rationalized it was this: my team benefited from my success as well because anybody that was on my team that answered the call, I made sure that they were taken care of as well. Right? I looked out for their careers. I spent endless hours with anybody that wanted to be developed. I never questioned. If you said you want, I pursued it. And even when you decided that you didn't want it anymore, you had to work really hard to convince me that you didn't want it anymore because I was still pushing you. So I think that's how I rationalized that people outside of that circle, I wouldn't say didn't necessarily matter, but I think that I felt accountable to them and to the people that I reported to who were also bought into my success. What I didn't understand were in a matrixed organization, the impact of that where leaders that were outside my immediate sphere were also watching and saying, yeah, maybe they were saying this person absolutely was getting it done, but I don't know if I want someone that's necessarily that abrasive. And I think I can admit that now that I was potentially abrasive. The second thing is that I didn't necessarily key in on, I didn't key in on, I did key in on if anybody showed some sort of a resistance that they were against me. And sometimes when people are asking you to pause, and this is where the emotional intelligence comes in, you have to know that they're asking you to pause for the right reason. And I wasn't able to discern whether or not it was for the right reason because I was blinded by the success that I wanted. Now, obviously, as I've told you, particularly recently, is that now my hope is to be who I am now. I hope to be the person that I needed back then. So, me now, the person that I am now, would have taken the old LB a really long way, much further than what I accomplished. My goals were very much short-sighted. I saw that I was going to do XYZ in 18 months, XYZ in 18 months. Now I had the long-term goal of being a vice president or a regional vice president or a general manager, but I didn't necessarily see all of the steps that it took to get there. And quite frankly, I know now I can be transparent about with myself about one of the challenges is that you need advocates, and I had them, but I had direct line advocates right up my leadership vertical. But the ones on the peripheral, they knew that I was like, I think I got along well with my peers, but I wasn't shy about if you were doing something that was suspect, that to get your success, I didn't have a lot of compassion for those individuals. And I think rather than pass judgment, I should have taken more time maybe to understand why they were where they were, and then help them to move into a path in a different direction because that would have shown that I had an ability to move my peers as well. So the ability to do that, to move horizontally and vertically and really diagonally, right, becomes really important. So oftentimes we're taught that our career is a ladder and it's really much more like a lattice. So it's not necessarily climbing up the ladder like this way. It's like you sometimes will go over here and sometimes you go over here, then you go up a couple and then you may go back across. And I think that there were opportunities that I asked questions of a very small group of individuals. And so now today, like, for example, I have what I call my board of directors. And so there are people, quite frankly, there are some people that I did not get along with back in the day, but I had a mutual respect with them. And so I was able to ask them, like, what were some of the things that you saw rubbed you the wrong way about what I did? Or what would you have cautioned me on? Or what did you want to caution me on? So they helped me to identify my blind spots. And then the leaders that believed in me, that were frankly candid, I think they do that too. But I think you have to have a well-rounded set of board of directors that will help you to do that. It's like a 360 feedback in order to identify what your strengths. Essentially, it's like doing a SWOT analysis, right?
Yeah.
And again, I don't think I even, again, undergraduate degree was in journalism. We learned running the business on the job, and a SWOT analysis as it is defined, or the definition of it, or what we see it as, which is identifying your strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. We didn't necessarily see it that way. We weren't really taught in that way.
If you think about the dynamics of that environment, and you and I can speak directly to it because it's cultish. Like, we're brought up in that up
Yeah.
or out culture. So you're ingrained to have a singular purpose and a singular mindset. So there's a level of manipulation that goes on in basically brainwashing you into that. But when you think about it in terms of leadership or leadership principles, the part that they don't teach you, and this goes to, we referenced this in one of our earlier episodes, what's the book that has the Cliff Notes version, the stuff that I'm not privy to? I think the lesson that we both should have gathered from there is that if you're looking at it from a perspective of leadership is influencing without authority. And that's the lesson that we did not pick up. We drew through conditioning that, hey, you make the production happen. And the results in terms of where you want to go career-wise is going to get there. And I think what happens is that, and this is probably a function of being 20 and not knowing anything, you buy into that stuff. So to your point, if you were able to lead the LB of that era, knowing what you know now, what would you have told him?
Oh, a lot. I think that in retrospect, like I said, some of the things would be, without question, it's one of the best training programs in the world, I would argue. But I think that it was very hierarchical. You've got 20-somethings running around at that time making six figures, mid six figures. And so we were predicated on getting that mid six figures. We were trying to be the next person to do that. It was very hierarchical. I think I would have expanded, I would say expand your thinking. Definitely, you think about it, right? As far as most people will say, the emotional intelligence movement really taking hold has been what, the last 15 years? And so if that had entered into the realm of where we were, I think that the company, and having gone back and utilized their services, you do see a lot of that now where there's more of it. And so you see it. So I would say that definitely shoring up your emotional intelligence skills. The goals are important, but you should have broader goals. That's also, I think, important. And that's something that I didn't necessarily think about then. And allyship in all its forms was and is critically important, right? When there are opportunities for where people can help advance your career, understand how to get to those people. So, most people will talk about mentorship and having a mentor, and that's all great. But for me, Sean was someone that was an area manager who not only was he a mentor, but he was an advocate. He was somebody that was mentioning my name when I wasn't in the room. He was somebody that was saying, hey, LB can actually do this job. I know he was an advocate because when I got promoted to assistant manager, I think he played a key role in that. I think about Brett was someone who played a role in my ascension when it came down to branch manager and then area manager. So those elements are important to be able to move your career forward. You got to have advocates. I think without advocates, it's very challenging. And then I think be open to constructive criticism, right? And there is a difference, right? People will say criticism is criticism, and constructive criticism is that people who have a vested interest in what you want to accomplish based off an established relationship is the goal. And so I think oftentimes when you think about, like, I started off with some of those people, they were my mentors and they grew into advocates or into sponsors. But be clear, I think it's extremely critical to have people that are mentioning your name when you are not in the room, when those opportunities come up. It wasn't something that I necessarily knew and processed it as that, but as I got moved on, like different companies, as I got into coaching and I did more reading, because I think I felt like when I was there, it was more, I was running off of my natural leadership abilities, having been an athlete and captain of the team and that sort of thing, being firstborn in terms of the pecking order and being responsible for my brothers, looking out for other kids in the community when I was growing up, and being someone that, people look to me for my advice and that sort of thing. But when I really started to read in the space of leadership and read in the space of coaching, it was just like the lights were just like exploding in my head. And I'm like, okay, that's why that didn't work. Oh, that's why I should have taken this approach. Oh, that's why this. And I think the other part of it, lastly, I will say, is that don't be so predicated on taking things personal, right? Everything is not personal. And oftentimes some of the decisions that are made have absolutely nothing to do with you. Absolutely nothing. and
Yeah.
it's a little humbling, actually, when you think about it, that it may have nothing to do with you. It may be that they feel like, I never thought about, like, when I was going up for regional winter manager opportunities, and there was this one particular area that's near where we were across the border, where I think a couple of the locations are now shuttered. And so you really don't know. You don't have the foresight, and you have to trust. But that was a challenge too, because I also questioned whether or not there were people who really did have my best interest. And
Yeah.
I could say in good confidence that they didn't, because when there were opportunities, I know my name wasn't getting mentioned by those individuals. So
Yeah, I think it's a catch-22. I think the aspect about that environment that's tricky is that, on the one hand, it is production and progress driven,
mhm,
and you can set whatever timeline that you want on it, but the mindset shift that happens is you really don't advance your career to the degree that you think you should until you focus on the process versus the
right,
outcome. So
absolutely,
I think the organization is never going to get a coach to bring that in, because it's just, its business model is on 100% turnover every 3 years. So
yeah,
you just keep the cycle going. But if you're looking at that environment and you're looking at maximizing the capability of a large percentage of the people that are there, the lesson that they should be taught, and this is a lesson for anybody that's early in your career: don't put an unnecessary timeline on any given thing. Focus on mastery. Whatever the
right,
job is, focus on mastering the elements of that job. And when you feel
right,
that is you've reached an appropriate level of mastery, if there is no other growth opportunity, then you move. Don't
yeah,
create these artificial timelines where you're rushing through and not really rounding out your capabilities, and
mhm.
because that keeps you in the hole.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the one thing that I will say, though, as a slight caveat to that, is that what I noticed was that, so that's why I worked all those Saturdays, was to get a better understanding of the processes, right? To get a better understanding of the system. And it also created competitive advantage because I knew that others didn't. And so in that instance, I don't know that I would define it as emotional intelligence, but I knew that I had a psychological advantage over the others. And that's not, to me, really a good example of emotional intelligence, because I saw it really exactly as that. I'm like, oh, it's an advantage. They don't want to do it. I will. And I knew that it translated to, it was perceived that I had more of a work ethic.
Just
Also
getting
wasn't,
yourself game time.
yeah. But I think the other part of it, though, was that it probably wasn't wise that I let other people know that I had more than what they had from a work ethic standpoint. So again, that's the execution of emotional intelligence, where you're like, and I think this is the other part of it too, is that you have to find the people who know I'm just going to say cheat codes for lack of a better description, but I don't necessarily mean cheating in the way of cheating, but know the real shortcuts to allow you to help maximize those opportunities. For example, I think you and I both know that the people who were more adept at sometimes you had a flat out advantage because they were out there. So on the Saturdays that I was like getting more proficient, those same people may have been out on the golf course. And so where flat out they were not as talented as I was, they were still moving. And then that was also really frustrating. So instead of getting frustrated, I should have taken the time, like you said, to understand the system. And if that's part of the system, it may not be one that you like, but it's one that you may need to understand and then make the decision on whether or not, it's negotiable or non-negotiable. But I think you're spot on that. Again, hindsight is 2020. And what we're trying to do is really talk with people about the hindsight that we have now. You can benefit from our 2020 to help you move throughout your career.
The part that stands out, like we talked about this early on in our why episode, you might be knocking it out of the park and you might have like ridiculous production numbers and all of these measurable things. And you might be sitting there thinking, everybody's talking about me.
Mm-hmm.
And the reality of it is that you can have the greatest numbers in the history of numbers, and odds are nobody is really going out of their way
Right.
to promote you. So it's on
Right.
you to be your best advocate. And to your point about the golf course thing, it's a fundamental principle of sales. People buy and do things for other people if they know, like, and trust you. So if you're not building personal relationships across your career or your sphere of influence,
Right.
you're going to constantly find yourself in that situation where your measurables might be great, but there's always going to be, oh, we don't really know what that person's about. And that's
Right.
probably, I would argue that your ability to build a network and build relationships where people know you and like you is more important that has more weight than actually your production.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think that, so you asked me this question earlier, so I guess I'm late to processing this, but it was also easier, right? It's easier to get the precision, hit the numbers and that sort of thing for, I think, a lot of people. But I think that there is this ambiguity about the idea and notion of being culturally adept. And so part of what you're talking about is that, right? Because again, I think it was in the first episode we talked about this, where if I put my nose to the grindstone and blah, 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 people are going to notice. I'm going to have these amazing numbers that nobody can refute. But again, to your point, if they don't trust you, if they don't think that you're going to be I've heard this throughout my career, and I have not talked about this part, but when I moved into the Fortune 500, I heard the term culture fit more times than I care to admit. It was just culture fit, culture fit, culture fit. And then you start saying, well, what does that mean? What are you really saying? And for me, it was like the catch-all phrase for whether or not you wanted to be selective, right, about who you wanted in your organization, because nobody could ever define what the culture fit was, to the extent that actually at one point there was training around not using the term culture fit and being more definitive about what are the skill sets that we want our employees to have as a part of this team, as a part of this organization, as a part of this area of responsibility, being more definitive about that so that people could see what that actually meant, as opposed to the nebulous culture fit. Right?
I mean, you're going to get me going on some of my soapboxing when you talk about culture fit, when you talk about overqualified, when you talk about all of these other things, which is basically like corporate shell game speak for any number of things. And I've seen it so many times on the staffing and recruiting end, where it's almost as if, and you'll even see it now, you're in the middle of the great resignation, the great reshuffle, the great rethink, and organizations are still having positions that are open for 3, 4, 5 months, and candidates are talking about how their interview process takes forever.
Oh yeah. No, I think it's a valid point, because we are seeing the impact. And to your point, the great resignation or whatever the new flavor of the month term that they're using for this phenomenon, is interesting because it does at least identify to some degree that companies still don't get it. And to me, I think it's pretty fascinating because so what I've also seen is there's probably a good amount of content out there where people are saying it's not really the Great Resignation. If you actually look at the numbers, it's really this versus that. But the reality is that you can give it whatever name that you want to give it. We still are in a period where people are leaving for whatever reason. They are more vocal on in the social sphere, right? On any of the platforms, particularly LinkedIn, where it's a business oriented platform where people are saying, hey, like they're sharing out. I don't feel like I'm being respected. I don't feel like that there's a sense of equity. I'm disenfranchised. I'm all these different things. And yet we still are being, as organizations, dismissive of what those are. And the end result is that at some point, your organization is going to suffer. That's just the bottom line.
Companies everywhere talk about our people are our most valuable asset. And then when you see the exit data, what are most people saying as their biggest factors for leaving? It's in and along the lines of all the things that you mentioned. I don't feel like I'm being seen. I don't feel like I'm being heard, understood, no sense of belonging. There's a misalignment between the stated values and the executed values.
Yep.
And people just aren't putting up with that anymore. People are holding companies accountable for what they say they are. And I think that's good, especially, again, we're all employees. And for too long, and this is a social commentary, for too long, it's been this one-sided relationship.
Yeah.
Organizations expect like ridiculous levels of loyalty from employees. And at the same time, if you have a health issue or if you have a family crisis or if you have something that happens where you have to step away, what level of loyalty does the company extend you? They're looking to replace you. And now it's bringing those things back into balance.
Yeah, I think that one of the things is that what I've tried to do when I'm having conversations with clients or general consulting conversations or the like, is that the other part that I think that's important to do, which is why I think emotional intelligence becomes this element that we also have to be inserting into the conversation, is that we will say the organization, so we will say the company. But what we're really talking about is the leadership within those organizations. And so I had a conversation today, and it was about how most companies, when you look at the research, or you have these conversations, these anecdotal conversations, is that they have what's called the frozen middle. So senior leadership does a decent job of communicating and cascading that information down, cascading plug again. But what happens is that, so now you have what, is that frozen middle, that they have the obligation to disseminate that information to the front line, and the front line is communicating up. And what freezes it is that it's compelling for the middle manager to execute on what is going to maintain their direct deposit, meaning whatever the numbers are that they're supposed to be hitting, those are the numbers that they're going to strive towards, and everything else is just noise. So I bring that up, for example, because when you try and explain to middle managers that diversity, equity, and inclusion is important, if you haven't drawn the correlation to how that is a distraction away from what may be their P&L accountability, right? Or their customer service accountability or their production accountability, that has to be clear. And I think that organizations, leadership are failing at doing that on a consistent basis. And as a result, the frozen middle says, if we think about this logically, right? So DEI, if I don't do it, is it going to cost me money? No. Oh. All right, let's get back there. Move the widgets, bang the blocks to get what we need to get. And so when you look at it from that standpoint, and again, if you have this conflict anywhere in your communication channel, if it's not DEI, if it's some other element, that conflict is going to impede one's ability to maximize performance. And so when I think about where we came from the training world of renting cars, believe it or not, there wasn't a lot of ambiguity in the message. It was fairly clear, pretty clear, clear enough to make the boatload of money that they've been making, right? To, like you said, a lot of people outside the organization oftentimes will criticize that turnover is built into the system. It's built in, it's a
Yep.
part of the success.
The interesting thing about your comment on the frozen middle. So you're a coach. I work for a coaching organization, and we've come to the same or similar conclusions because when you look at the execution of the work, it's from the middle down.
Right.
And the gap at an enterprise level, at an organizational level, is leadership will come up with strategy, will
Hmm.
come up with a framework for execution.
Hmm.
They'll drop the execution framework on their middle managers and say, more often than not, we'll say, just go do it or figure it
Hmm.
out.
Right.
Where, what needs to be done, there needs to be, okay, here's the framework. Here's what we're trying to get to. Where's the collaborative exercise in mapping out the process and the plan for execution and
Hmm.
tying it to the what's in it for me? That part that gets missed, that's a big opportunity for a lot of organizations to move the needle in terms of getting their strategic objectives met. And that's all part of that sort of leadership journey that we talk about is how do you tie it all together from a strategy and execution perspective. So we talked a bit about your early career
Hmm.
and some of the lessons that you learned there. What about as you left that organization and then progressed through
Yeah.
others?
Yeah. I would say that it's interesting. The reason I chuckled is that when we were having conversations about my next move into the Fortune 500, I distinctly remember you asking me a question about, are you sure? And I was like, oh yeah. Again, I would say so many lessons learned there, right? I would start with, I very seldom speak in terms of absolutes, but always know where you are entering an organization. It determines how you will progress through the organization. And so, what I misfired on in terms of understanding was I was taking the mindset of the company that I'd left, where you could come in, where everybody actually had to come in as a management trainee and work their way up. And as I was interviewing through that process to get into this organization, that's what I was told. Oh yeah, you'll be able to move up fairly quickly. Blah 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 blah. But what I didn't know at that time, and I honestly hadn't done the research, and I had never been in the Fortune 500, was that it's important to know where you enter because it's gonna determine your trajectory. Unless you're fortunate enough to find someone again who is an advocate or maybe starting off as a mentor who develops into a sponsor or an advocate. It is more challenging, not impossible, but I think more challenging to move to a position of expanded accountability and making more money and all of that without having a good sense of that. So, for example, coming into an organization that's like a Fortune 500 as a unit manager, unless it has a specified track to VP, you've definitely got to work your career like a lattice and kind of move around and don't necessarily buy into what people are telling you, because oftentimes the reason that people are telling you these things is because it benefits them and their leadership and their opportunity to grow. Now, there are times like the one point in my career where my career stalled. I had a leader who hired me, and what he found out very quickly was that I had an intense work ethic and that I wasn't shy about making the necessary changes. I had an eye for process improvement and that I had an eye for being able to get the most out of people because I treated them with dignity and respect. Crazy concept. And I really wanted to see people grow as a part of my organization. So I think about at one point I had someone who had been with the organization for 40 years. She said, well, there's really nowhere else for me to go. I'm maxed out on my salary, so I won't make any more after this. And I asked her, said, what are some things outside of work that are important to you? And she had told me some goals that she wanted to achieve outside of work. And I said, okay, well, this is what we're going to do. I want you to work on those things and I want you to check in with me. And so whenever we would have her checkpoints, we would talk about it. And so at first I think she probably thought that I was like not thinking straight that day. But I followed up with her because I wanted to know, I had a vested interest in knowing how she was doing with the goal that she wanted to achieve. And when she achieved it, she came to me and she said, I really appreciate you pushed me. I probably would not have achieved this goal if we hadn't had this conversation. Right. Now, for me, that was important for a couple of things. I was able to connect with her on something that was important for her. But frankly, she was a great employee before then, and she was a greater one afterwards. Right? I've had a couple of people that said to me, I want to go back and get my degree. And one in particular, I said, are you sure? Because if we're going to do this, we're doing it, which means I'm going to stay on you. I'm going to constantly be asking you about it, asking you for follow up, give me updates and that sort of thing. She's like, oh, yeah. So she got started and then she hit a bump in the road. And I said, okay, so what are we doing? Are we getting back in the saddle? And long story short, not only did she get her undergraduate degree, but she wound up getting her MBA as well. And every time I see one of her social media posts, it makes me proud when she still says my manager. Have we ever worked together on the same team in years?
Right.
But it's meaningful. And I think that it's those sorts of connections that people will stay longer. When the old adage, people don't quit companies, they quit managers or they quit leaders. That's something that, again, you've seen firsthand that it's important, I think, to do that. And I don't know that we're willing necessarily all the time to take the time to do it.
Yeah, all good points. I keep going back to something that you just said. That's another fallacy that we got conditioned to believe. Like we came up in a culture and in training where growth is seen as only vertical.
Mhm.
And in some respects, we still see the world that way. Like you and I have had this conversation before. Well, look, you got to evaluate whatever position is on the long-term considerations of what you want
Mhm.
to accomplish from an overall career arc. So don't
Mhm.
make a long-term decision based on short-term criteria.
Absolutely.
So growth can mean any number of things. It just depends on what you want to accomplish. So growth could be a lateral move into a different division that gives you, more velocity vertically where that doesn't exist within the silo that you're in. If you're looking at navigating your career, it's not linear. And that's the other thing that a lot of people need to, even senior people in their career
Yeah.
need to look at is
Yeah. The ladder
what's
versus the lattice. Yeah.
yeah.
And there's another point that you brought up that I think is also valid when you were talking about the whole idea of understanding that where you are in the organization also matters. And it's also in correlation to where your leadership, right, sees you. And oftentimes leaders will tuck you under their wing, not necessarily for the right reason. And so you have to be able to see that and be able to negotiate that as well, because you may be doing so well at what it is that you do that they only view you as valuable in that role. And so it's important to also be clear and understand that one, you're very communicative about where you want to be in the organization and exhibit that as well. Because sometimes becoming the subject matter expert, a lot of times people say, well, they only see me as X. And so how do I get to Y, right? When some of those things are learning outside the sphere that you're currently in, working to get those opportunities. But again, sometimes you definitely need to identify, and that's why the advocate becomes, again, so critical, right? Because if you don't have an advocate that can help you move, then I think that becomes more of a challenge to
So
identify that.
there's an intentionality component to it as well. We always talk about you're the CEO of your own career. So you need to be
Yeah.
honest. You need to be able to be honest about where your gaps
Mm.
and build out your own IDP and be intentional about driving your IDP on a month to month basis on, hey,
Mhm.
these are the gaps that I have that are keeping me from getting to this other spot. Hey, Mr. Manager, Miss Manager, here are the things that I want to accomplish. Where can I get exposure or experience across these areas
Yeah.
to shore up my ability? And that's the other part of it too, is that, hey, you might have an advocate that is keeping you in your role in your
Mhm.
silo. They're driving their own career because they know your production is going to propel down. So
Right.
you have to look at tying all of that stuff together too. We've had a couple of really good, conversations over the last two episodes. What are the key takeaways when you look at your transition from a Ute? That's a
Mhm.
My Cousin Vinny reference, bad one. Still, key takeaways from that period, and then key takeaways as a professional when you're passing that down. And
Yeah.
what do people need to pay attention to as they're navigating their own career and trying to accelerate?
early on, the good fortune for me was being in these varied environments, I think prepared me for what was to be the future. And so I think that we live in the moment. We don't have the good fortune of foresight. So as you live, you do have to be intentional about planning what the future will hold. So as a youth, I don't know that I necessarily knew that. So as I think most youth, some people are super clear on what it is that they want to do. I think what was super clear for me was that I always wanted to help people and to help people to develop, right? That's been a recurring theme. But what I also knew was that I had to be in spheres where there was an opportunity to make that sort of an impact. And quite frankly, I was money motivated. And so I wanted to be in that same place. And the two weren't in misalignment. It's still important that you could be able to do that. But I do think that being able to take who you are, because you are your superpower. Actually, I think, Jim, you actually posted something on LinkedIn about this. And I think it's important for us to understand that each individual, like who we are, is what is our competitive advantage. And looking at that, what I did was try to build on the strengths that I had to catapult me to the next opportunity. And at the same time, something that you mentioned earlier was this idea and notion of trying to identify your gaps as well, right? Your blind spots, and needing and having people in your sphere that can help you do that, so that you have a clearer sense of where it is that you want to, of where you want to go. And then lastly, I would say probably the whole idea of that your career is not a ladder, it's a lattice, right? So you're going to go up, across. Quite frankly, sometimes you may dip once in order to kind of catapult. And I think when you look at the careers of a lot of people, a lot of leaders, and you read on their backgrounds, they will share this story.
That's great stuff. So that wraps up, or is starting to wrap up, episode 3. So thanks for joining us. And again, this will be distributed across all podcast channels. So make sure you like, subscribe, comments, give us feedback, all of that stuff. We are 3 episodes in. We have a couple more that are coming up before we transition into our featured guest format.
What's up next?
Next is going to be all about me. So
this will be the fun part. I get to ask all the questions.
I'll need to focus on making sure that we keep it within the 30-minute time limit. Otherwise, we'll be talking forever. Keep an eye out for these episodes dropping. But thanks for joining us. Hopefully it was entertaining, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Later.